Hey guys, tonight we're tucking ourselves into one of history's most delicate disasters, Victorian sex education. Yes, the era of top hats, petticoats, and so much repression you'd think everyone was secretly allergic to their own elbows. Victorian England, a place where the word leg was so scandalous that even piano limbs got covered up. So before we get started, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. If it's past midnight, congratulations, you're officially Victorian. Sleep deprived and worried about your morals. Now, dim the lights, crank up a fan for that comforting white noise, and get cozy. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how Victorians learned about sex when showing any skin above your ankle was scandalous? Did mothers sit their daughters down for a gentle chat? Or did everyone just silently hope for the best and pray not to faint at the sight of any uncovered skin? Did anyone actually know where babies came from? Or was it just a vague suggestion involving stalks, cabbage patches, or divine will? How did anyone ever figure out what to do on their wedding night when the only diagrams available were in Latin and possibly upside down? Was there a secret underground club for people who dared to say the word pregnant out loud? And most importantly, how long would you survive in a world where saying intercourse at the dinner table might actually get you disowned? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1863. Your corset is too tight, your mustache wax is dangerously flammable, and your entire understanding of reproduction is about to be taught by someone who thinks looking at a tomato might get you pregnant. Good luck. No one in Victorian England sat down for a heart-to-heart about where babies come from. If you were lucky, your sex education was a warning not to ride a bicycle too enthusiastically or a stern look whenever someone mentioned nature. The actual curriculum was a well-practiced tradition of pretending nothing existed below the neck. Let's set the scene. You're a middle-class Victorian child, hunched over a copy of Pilgrim's Progress, trying desperately not to ask any questions that might lead to a parental fainting spell. The air in the drawing room is thick with the smell of coal, boiled cabbage, and dread. You clear your throat to inquire about something you heard at school, perhaps a passing remark about storks or the mechanics of marriage. Your mother freezes, your father's mustache bristles, and the family dog whimpers in solidarity. The silence is so oppressive, you wonder if the Queen herself will appear just to say not in front of the children. In this great age of invention, railways, telegraphs, and factories puffing out enough smoke to cover any embarrassment, you'd think someone might invent a manual, or at the very least a helpful pamphlet. Instead, the general approach to sex education is to hand you a book about the dangers of self-abuse and hope that the word abuse is scary enough to prevent any further investigation. Anything even slightly suggestive is swiftly banished. Novels with the word passion, art with an exposed elbow, even the family piano's shapely legs get hidden under ruffled little skirts, just in case. Questions about the facts of life are, in theory, directed to one's mother. In practice, you get one of three answers. A tight-lipped ask your father, a distracted you'll understand when you're older, or a frantic change of subject to the weather, politics, or the migratory patterns of birds, the literal kind. The message is clear. Knowing too much, or anything at all, might damage your chances of becoming a respectable adult. Or worse, it might make you French. Meanwhile, boys get their own brand of enlightenment, which mostly involves being handed a cricket bat, a cold bath, and a vague warning about the dangers of loose women. It's a masterclass in saying absolutely nothing while sounding tremendously authoritative. The hope is that, between a rigorous schedule of Latin conjugations and family-friendly hymns, there'll be no time left for any risky thoughts. For girls, the silence is so complete it practically echoes. At best, you're advised to avoid strenuous activities, novels with too much excitement, or spending time alone in a conservatory. Instead of education, you get etiquette lessons. Walk with your knees together. Never speak to a man unless properly introduced. And above all, never display curiosity. unless it's about embroidery patterns. The result is a nation in which generations grow up terrified of their own bodies, convinced that spontaneous combustion is a real risk if they ask the wrong question. Friendships become underground support groups for the dangerously curious, with coded notes passed in church pews and wild speculation about how Mrs. Havisham managed to have 6 children while looking so permanently bewildered. Every so often, rumours surface of a brave soul who actually asked their parents where babies come from, only to be packed off to boarding school with extra Latin homework and a stern warning about the perils of improper curiosity. The cycle of ignorance renews itself, season after season, as reliable as the blooming of the family aspidistra. And yet, somehow, life continues. The birds keep singing, the bees keep buzzing, and the British population stubbornly increases. Perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about Victorian sex education. In a society utterly determined not to talk about anything below the collarbone, nature still finds a way. So you lay back in bed, the fire crackling in the grate, and fall asleep wondering what else grown-ups aren't telling you. Comforted only by the knowledge that at least you're not the family piano, forced to wear a skirt for eternity. All in the name of decency. In a society where even the mention of a piano's leg was considered indecent, navigating daily conversation was an Olympic sport in euphemism. Women draped furniture in little skirts, and God help you if your petticoat showed in public. If you've ever blushed when your phone auto-corrected duck to something else, you'd never survive Victorian table manners. Let's paint the scene. You're at a respectable dinner party in 1859. You've practiced the correct fork order, you've mastered the delicate art of not fainting into your soup, and you've spent at least an hour making sure not a single hair is out of place. Suddenly, someone's chair scrapes against the floor, revealing, horror of horrors, a slender, elegantly curved table leg. Conversation halts. Several monocles pop. Aunt Edith hastily drapes a doily over the offending limb, and everyone resumes talking about the weather as if nothing has happened. In Victorian England, even your furniture had to maintain its modesty. Now, you might think this is all just a little over the top, but remember, these are people who believed that a bare piano leg could lead to moral collapse. The logic went like this. If an exposed table leg was left unaddressed, what next? Socks hanging on the line for all to see. Someone mentioning trousers within earshot of a clergyman. The domino effect could bring down the very foundations of civilization, starting with the family room and ending with dogs and cats living together in complete social anarchy. It's not just furniture. Human limbs were equally suspect. A woman who let her skirt ride up even a few inches above her ankle might as well have announced her intention to run away with the circus. If your petticoat peeked out as you climbed into a carriage, expect scandalized gasps, a warning letter from your grandmother, and possibly a formal apology issued in the local newspaper. This is a society where ankles had the same social effect as a modern wardrobe malfunction at the Oscars, shocking, unforgettable, and guaranteed to be discussed for years. Of course, this led to some truly inventive vocabulary. No one in polite company would dare say the word leg. Instead, you had to use limb, or the slightly fancier lower extremity. If you were discussing chickens at dinner, as one does, you'd refer to drumsticks, and hope your guests didn't faint from the implicit naughtiness. It's a miracle anyone made it through a meal without accidentally starting a minor scandal. But all this polite avoidance created a sort of social minefield. You never quite knew which words were safe and which were secretly loaded. Children learned early to listen for coded warnings if a grown-up coughed, changed the subject, or suddenly began discussing the rain. You'd better drop whatever word you just said and never repeat it, ever again. It's like playing conversational minesweeper, but with extra embroidery and no high scores. And then there were the visual dangers. Fashion itself became an arms race of concealment. Dresses swelled to the size of small dinghies, crinolines and bustles multiplied, and every visible edge was ruffled, trimmed, or beribboned into submission. Not even boots escaped scrutiny. Advertisements showed only the uppers, lest someone get ideas about souls or, heaven forbid, heels. If you dared to cross your legs, make sure to do it behind a newspaper, a sturdy fern, or an unsuspecting spaniel. Naturally, some Victorians found the whole affair faintly ridiculous, but ridicule was best expressed through carefully anonymous letters to the editor or satirical cartoons that no one admitted to finding funny. Open rebellion, like, say, referring to a chair leg without blushing, was best left to foreigners, artists, or the sort of relatives who only got invited to Christmas dinner once. By the end of a long day of sidestepping innuendo and disguising your furniture, you're left exhausted, hungry for a world where you can say sock without fear, and oddly grateful for sweatpants and IKEA. So, as you lie back, imagine a society where even your piano needs pajamas, and remember, in Victorian England, scandal is only ever one exposed leg away. Sleep tight and keep your furniture modest. For most Victorian daughters, the talk was less of a conversation and more of a long, meaningful stare, followed by advice to avoid reading novels and to never, ever sit on a gentleman's lap, even if he's your uncle. If you wanted real answers, you'd have better luck consulting the family parrot. Let's set the stage. You, an inquisitive young Victorian lady, are suddenly called into the drawing room. The fire is flickering. Your mother is perched on the edge of her chair, clutching a handkerchief and exuding the kind of nervous energy usually reserved for tax audits or surprise visits from the vicar. You're prepared for anything, except, of course, for anything useful. She clears her throat, gives you a look so serious that even the clock on the mantel stops ticking, and asks if you've been reading unsuitable fiction. This is not a question, it's a warning, because everyone knows that novels lead to dangerous thoughts, and dangerous thoughts lead to fainting spells, ruined reputations, and worst of all, awkward conversations. Instead of practical information, you receive an impressive catalogue of things never to do. Don't talk to strangers. Don't look at men on horseback. Don't run. Don't jump. Don't ask questions about anything below your collarbone, and for heaven's sake, don't touch yourself. If you must touch anything, let it be lace, a prayer book, or possibly a doily, preferably under direct maternal supervision. Your mother may tell you, "Just be good, dear," with the solemnity of someone issuing a royal decree. What constitutes good is left as an exercise for the listener. The closest she'll get to a fact is a whisper that marriage changes everything, followed by a shudder and a request for more tea. You're now more confused than when you started, and the only concrete takeaway is that chairs are for sitting, laps are for scandal, and no one is entirely sure how you yourself came into existence. Any attempt to ask about, say, marriage or children is swiftly redirected. Why not take up watercolours? Your mother suggests, as if painting the world's saddest bunch of violets will protect you from the mysteries of biology. If that fails, you might be given a heavy book on etiquette, where the only advice about relationships is how to politely decline a second slice of cake without looking greedy. If you persist, if you are truly reckless and decide to push the issue, your mother may call in reinforcements. This means a parade of aunts, each specializing in a unique brand of avoidance. Aunt Mildred will quote scripture, Aunt Gertrude will faint, and Aunt Beatrice will offer terrifying warnings about ruined women she claims to have read about in the newspaper. No one defines ruined, but judging by the tone, it's at least as bad as tracking mud into the front hall. Meanwhile, you receive endless reminders about your reputation, which must be protected like the crown jewels. This is why your skirt is long enough to sweep the floor, your stockings are thick enough to deflect arrows, and your corset is so tight it could double as a submarine hull. In the Victorian playbook, prevention is the only form of education. The goal is to make sure nothing ever happens, and if something does happen, to pretend it didn't. So you learn to gather your intelligence elsewhere. Hushed conversations with older cousins behind the hydrangea bushes, scandalous stories overheard from the kitchen staff, or, in extreme desperation, a copy of a medical encyclopedia accidentally left out by your physician uncle, open to the diagram of a frog. That's about as close as you'll get to a formal lesson. And at the end of the day, you curl up in your starched sheets, clutching a diary full of questions and a heart full of confusion. You drift off to sleep, convinced that the world is full of dangers no one will explain, and that the only thing more mysterious than marriage is why your mother keeps the parrot around when it seems to know so much more than anyone else. Good night, and remember, don't even think about it. Victorian fathers were equally helpful, usually suggesting that any feelings of curiosity could be fixed with vigorous exercise, cold showers, or a sudden interest in stamp collecting. The best advice a father could give was, don't embarrass the family, preferably while maintaining direct eye contact with the wall. Let's take a stroll into the classic Victorian study, a shrine to mahogany, the lingering scent of pipe tobacco, and a silence so thick you could bounce a shilling off it. You, as a youth in search of answers, have been summoned. Perhaps you're wondering about courtship. Or maybe you simply want to understand why everyone in the house tenses up when the subject of marital relations is even hinted at. Your father, fortified by the protective barrier of his newspaper, prepares for this historic event by briefly considering the wisdom of the ages and then settling on something he read in a cricket manual. There are two ways this conversation can go, and neither of them involves an actual conversation. The first is the brisk, practical method. I say, old chap, best not to dwell on such things. Get some fresh air, play cricket, and remember, idle hands are the devil's workshop. In the Victorian world, every possible adolescent feeling could be solved with enough time spent batting at a leather ball or developing a tragic obsession with beetle collections. Physical exertion, it was believed, would burn away unwanted thoughts faster than a bottle of smelling salts at a fainting contest. The second method is even more direct. A change of subject so rapid it could cause whiplash. How about those steam trains, eh? If pressed further, your father might offer a half-remembered anecdote about his own youth, involving a stern schoolmaster, a cold river, and the healing power of a hard day's rowing. All other topics are deemed too risky, too embarrassing, or too French. The logic seems to be, if you stay distracted long enough, you'll never have time to get yourself into trouble. If you persist, you might receive one of the great Victorian non-answers you'll find out when you're older. Or, the even more popular, ask your mother, thereby completing the world's least helpful game of conversational hot potato. Should you, in a fit of youthful courage, bring up actual relationships, your father will take a sudden, keen interest in polishing his shoehorn or examining the intricacies of his carpet. Personal connection is never on the agenda. Public image, however, is everything. The phrase, "don't embarrass the family," is not a request. It's the law of the land. Your father's job is to maintain a household reputation so spotless it could pass a white glove inspection by Queen Victoria herself. Feelings, questions, and most bodily functions are classified as dangerous threats to this delicate equilibrium. The only safe topics are the weather, the empire, and, of course, cricket statistics. This approach does wonders for adolescent confusion. You are left with the impression that romance is best handled by focusing on your bowling average, and that any strong emotion can be cured by a bracing walk and possibly an application of horse liniment. Fathers recommend hobbies the way modern self-help books recommend mindfulness. A lad with a good butterfly collection doesn't get into trouble, one might say, not noticing that most butterflies are more informed about the facts of life than their human observers. If by some miracle the topic remains, you'll be told tales of iron self-control, of men who went their entire lives without ever knowing what the word intimacy even meant. The ideal Victorian man was not only stoic, but so emotionally constipated he could win a prize for it. The family honour, the father will remind you, is your true legacy. Everything else is a distraction, a sign of weakness, or at the very least, something that can be sorted out by running laps around the cricket pitch until you forget what you were curious about in the first place. And so, with your mind spinning, you're handed a cricket bat and a subtle but powerful reminder: never embarrass the family. The door closes, the pipe is relit, and the grand tradition of Victorian silence continues, undisturbed by anything so vulgar as honest information. Good luck out there. And remember, if you feel confused, there's always stamp collecting. Before you learned anything about anatomy, you had to contend with a wardrobe designed to actively confuse you. Corsets squeezed everything out of sight, and men's trousers were padded in places you're not supposed to look at, let alone mention. Let's imagine you're waking up in Victorian England, fumbling out of your high bed, blinking at the world through a haze of starch and lace. The first lesson of the day isn't about anatomy, relationships, or even basic biology. It's a full-contact sport called getting dressed. For young ladies, this means the ritual of the corset, a stiff, heavily boned contraption engineered to mold your body into the ideal shape, or at least the ideal shape according to Queen Victoria's personal tailor and a handful of men who've never worn a corset in their lives. You stand, arms raised, while your mother and a small army of sisters, cousins, and possibly a neighbour with strong hands set about tightening laces with the determination of sailors securing a ship before a hurricane. There's creaking, groaning, and possibly some faint Victorian swearing, botheration. By the end, you're upright, breathless, and so compressed that sneezing could become a catastrophic event. The goal, you're told, is elegance and modesty, although the effect is more along the lines of delicately terrified sausage. Corsets serve multiple purposes. Officially, they're about health, posture, and keeping one's bosom sufficiently uplifted for the demands of society tease. Unofficially, they're a universal excuse for fainting at awkward moments, missing stair steps, and declining third helpings of boiled mutton. Forget learning about your own anatomy. After an hour in a corset, you're not sure you even have organs anymore. Men, of course, have their own version of anatomical confusion, the infamous codpiece. While technically more of a Renaissance fashion, the Victorian era was not immune to the art of the padded trouser. Men's clothing was designed to signal status and masculinity, which meant adding mysterious bulges, stiff panels, and an entire army of buttons right where the innocent eye dare not wander. Victorian tailors devoted entire careers to ensuring that a gentleman's dignity was preserved at all costs, even if it meant accidentally inventing origami for the lower half. If you were a curious young person, this wardrobe situation created more questions than answers. You might think you're about to learn the mysteries of life, but you're really just learning how to fasten 100 hooks and eyes while avoiding your own reflection. If, heaven forbid, you glimpsed a sibling's undergarments flapping on the wash line, it was less educational and more like seeing a cryptid in the wild, shocking, inexplicable, and probably dangerous to your moral fibre. For women, corsets weren't just about fashion, they were about propriety, which in Victorian code meant don't let anyone guess you have internal organs. Medical authorities, who coincidentally were almost all men, warned that the female body was inherently unstable and needed constant structural support like a wobbly bookshelf. The result was a nation of women who could barely breathe but looked, at least from the neck up, absolutely serene. At balls, fainting was practically a competitive sport. If you didn't swoon at least once a season, you might be sent back to finishing school. Men, meanwhile, learned to adjust their waistcoats and arrange their trousers with all the subtlety of a street magician. There were strict, unspoken rules about eye contact, conversations, and what constituted an accidental glance. Codpieces and padded fronts were supposed to project power, but mostly they projected confusion. The only lesson learned was that looking directly at a gentleman's lower half might trigger a duel or a hasty retreat behind the nearest fern. So before you got anywhere near actual sex education, you were schooled in a system of fabric, fastenings, and plausible deniability. You might spend your entire adolescence believing that bodies are mostly made of whalebone, ribbons, wool, and shame. As you collapse into bed at the end of another exhausting day of being trussed, tucked, and buttoned into submission, you can't help but wonder, if this is what it takes just to get dressed. What else are the grown-ups hiding? Good night, and may your dreams be free of laces. Imagine waking up one morning to discover your body has betrayed you, and the only advice available is have some gruel and stop being hysterical. If you ask too many questions, you'd be sent to bed with a copy of the Book of Common Prayer. Puberty in Victorian times was a bit like being haunted by your own skeleton. One day, you're happily climbing apple trees or skipping stones in the pond, and the next, you're growing hair in new places. Your voice is cracking, or you're suddenly fainting in public. The changes hit without warning and, naturally, without explanation. Victorians were masters of denial, and so your mother simply offers you an extra spoonful of porridge and tells you to avoid sitting on cold stone walls, as if that alone could hold back the tides of adolescence. For boys, the confusion came with added layers of guilt. If your voice dropped at the dinner table, Uncle George would cough awkwardly, your sisters would snicker, and your father would recommend joining the cricket team, because sport builds character and keeps the mind pure. That's code for run around until you forget you're becoming an adult. If you started to grow a mustache, congratulations, you were now expected to act like a miniature gentleman, hold open doors, and never, ever speak to anyone about the fact that you might one day need to buy a razor. Girls, meanwhile, found themselves trapped in a whirlpool of lace, hygiene mysteries, and cryptic warnings about womanly changes. The arrival of a first period was rarely announced, discussed, or frankly understood. If you asked your mother why you suddenly had to carry a spare handkerchief everywhere, she'd mutter something about nature's calendar and send you outside to pick lavender. Older sisters might pass along a secret stash of rags or sanitary aprons, which sound a lot more helpful than they actually were. But otherwise, you were left to muddle through, fortified only by the hope that you'd done nothing to deserve this punishment. Of course, the adults around you took every opportunity to avoid your questions. If you complained about aching bones, spots, or overwhelming waves of emotion, the standard response was, "Have you tried being more cheerful?" Or let's say an extra prayer and drink a cup of beef tea. Medical advice was, at best, confusing and at worst utterly useless. Doctors believed that puberty, especially in girls, was a delicate, dangerous time. Too much reading could send you into hysterics, while vigorous activity might cause your insides to wander off in search of a more responsible host. The safest route apparently was to sit very still, embroider tiny flowers, and avoid thinking about anything remotely exciting. And let's not forget the social minefield that came with these changes. As soon as you showed any sign of adolescence, you were expected to be more ladylike or manly, although no one could define exactly what that meant. You might be handed a new wardrobe of clothing, stiffer collars, tighter corsets, higher necklines that seemed specifically engineered to make you as uncomfortable as possible. There was an unspoken rule that any evidence of growing up had to be hidden, minimized, or immediately redirected with a brisk discussion of the weather. The only real guidance came from other kids, and even that was mostly rumor and wild speculation. Someone's cousin once said eating too many turnips would delay puberty, while a neighbor insisted that thinking impure thoughts would bring it on early. You learned quickly that the safest way to navigate this confusing time was to ask as few questions as possible, nod whenever an adult spoke, and write all your real concerns in a diary you kept hidden inside a hollowed-out grammar textbook. So, as you lay awake in your high Victorian bed, heart pounding with confusion and hormones, you clutch your prayer book, stare at the ceiling, and wonder how anyone ever survived growing up. And in the morning, when your mother serves you more gruel and tells you to smile, you resolve to keep your questions and your new moustache very much to yourself. Good night, and may your dreams be free of mysterious rashes. For many Victorians, their wedding night was their first real-life biology lesson, except the textbook was another human being who was equally confused, terrified, and possibly weeping into a monogrammed pillowcase. Let's set the mood. You've just survived a 12-hour wedding ceremony, endured 3 separate toasts warning against the dangers of immoderate affection, and listened to Aunt Agnes declare, loudly and repeatedly, that a well-behaved woman is always slightly chilly. Now, finally, you and your new spouse are alone, in a room so thickly decorated with lace and antimacassars that it looks like you're sleeping inside a particularly uptight wedding cake. No one has told you what is supposed to happen next. You may have pieced together a vague outline from childhood whispers, cryptic warnings, or a misplaced French novel, but Victorian propriety has done its level best to keep you clueless. Your parents never discussed relations except in the context of never discuss relations. Your schoolbook skipped straight from the circulatory system to how to write a proper thank you note, and even your most scandalous friend once fainted at the sight of a classical statue. Now, here you are. 2 adults, both dressed in more buttons and ribbons than a haberdashery, standing nervously at opposite ends of an enormous bed. The atmosphere is thick with dread, lavender water, and the faintest scent of anxiety. Every accidental touch is cause for alarm. You may attempt a conversation about the weather, the quality of the wedding cake, or the merits of the family's new carriage, but your voice keeps cracking and your spouse seems ready to leap out the window at the first sign of actual intimacy. Let's be honest, there's a reason why so many Victorian honeymoon diaries begin with polite statements about the journey, the weather, and the church bells, and then abruptly stop for several days. The Victorian wedding night was not about passion, fireworks, or a sudden blossoming of carnal wisdom. It was about 2 people awkwardly fumbling through layers of fabric, etiquette, and a profound lack of reliable information. And let's not forget, if your only prior experience with the human body was through the opaque lens of corsets and codpieces, the sight of bare skin could come as a genuine shock. Some newlyweds might actually apologize for having knees. Practical matters didn't help. Victorian bedrooms were cold, creaky, and often shared a thin wall with the in-laws, who were not above pressing their ear to the keyhole in the name of family honour. Beds squeaked, candles guttered, and the odds of accidentally setting the monogrammed pillowcase on fire were not 0. At any given moment, a stray housemaid, an overexcited dog, or a decorative urn could invade the proceedings. If things went spectacularly badly, one or both parties might simply break down in tears. After all, the list of potential disasters was long: fainting, crying, accidental headbutting, and, in rare cases, a desperate flight to the guest room under cover of darkness. If things went only slightly less badly, the couple might agree, without ever saying a word, to focus on letter writing and mutual hobbies for the foreseeable future. And yet, somehow, Victorian society managed to carry on. Children were produced, sometimes in great numbers, as if to prove that confusion is no match for biology's stubborn optimism. Over time, most couples sorted things out, often with the help of a well-thumbed medical dictionary, some off-handed advice from a tipsy uncle, or simply trial and error conducted under the watchful gaze of the family portrait gallery. So, as you lie in bed, both grateful and exhausted, you reflect that, for all its terrors, the wedding night marks the beginning of something new, a partnership built on mutual bewilderment, shared secrets, and the unspoken agreement never to mention any of this to your children. Good night, and may your pillowcase remain dry and unscorched. If you turn to a ladies' magazine for answers, you'd find endless advice on maintaining purity and preserving modesty, plus tips on how to embroider a pillow sham, which is frankly more useful than most of the actual sex advice. Picture yourself as a curious young woman, flipping through the glossy, heavily inked pages of the latest Ladies' Home Companion or the proper young lady's journal. You're hoping for practical wisdom, or at least a clue about the mysteries adults refuse to explain. Instead, you're greeted with articles titled, "On the Moral Benefits of Bathing the Family Cat," and hints for maintaining the most modest posture during afternoon tea. There are recipes for blancmange, suggestions for repurposing old hats, and diagrams for complex lacework. But when it comes to sex education, the most direct sentence is, "A true lady never finds herself in an indelicate position." the euphemism is everywhere. The closest you get to actual advice is a cryptic column on wifely duties, which starts off promisingly and then veers into a 5-paragraph treatise on the proper storage of table linens. If you want specifics, prepare to read between the lines, often literally, as the most interesting advice is crammed into the margins, disguised as tips for gardening or the optimal number of layers for a petticoat in May. It's as if the editors were contractually obliged to avoid any sentence that might lead the reader to have a thought, let alone a feeling. The most scandalous thing in these magazines is usually the suggestion that you might refresh your bloom by pinching your cheeks before entering a room. If you ever stumble on an article daring to mention the marriage bed, it will inevitably circle back to the importance of floral arrangements, the virtue of a spotless pillowcase, and the merits of lemon-scented water as a means of maintaining innocence of complexion. Even when readers wrote in with genuine, heartfelt questions, "What should I expect after my wedding night?" or "Why did my mother's friend vanish for 9 months and return with a baby?" the answers were wrapped in a cocoon of gentle suggestions and moral platitudes. You'd be advised to consult with your elders, who, as you know by now, are more likely to recite the Psalms than the facts of life, to pray for wisdom, or to distract yourself with a spot of needlework until your questions go away on their own. There were, of course, entire sections devoted to avoiding improper conduct. The rules were both extensive and confusing. Never walk unchaperoned. Never accept gifts from a gentleman, unless you are engaged, and even then only if it's a book of Psalms. And always maintain a minimum distance of 3 feet between yourself and any male, unless that male is your doctor, and even then, only if he's old, squinting, and accompanied by a nun. On rare occasions, a bolder publication might include a health column, possibly written by a lady doctor, almost certainly a man with a strong opinion on liver tonic. These columns discussed things like female complaints and nervous exhaustion in the vaguest terms possible, sometimes recommending a daily stroll or, if things got desperate, a spoonful of castor oil. Not exactly the birds and the bees. And then there were the etiquette quizzes, multiple choice scenarios in which every answer is write a thank you note and look at the floor. You begin to realize that, as far as Victorian magazines are concerned, the solution to every dilemma is to embroider something, drink weak tea, and never speak of anything that could cause a ripple in the stagnant pond of polite society. So, you set aside your magazine, perhaps a little better at cross-stitch but no closer to understanding the human condition. You gaze out the window, watching life go by, and wonder if there's a secret club where people actually talk about these things. If there is, it certainly isn't advertised in the Ladies' Home Companion. Good night, and may your pillow shams be flawlessly embroidered, even if your questions remain thoroughly unanswered. Men swapped tall tales and half-truths in smoke-filled clubs, where the loudest voice usually belonged to someone who once saw a lady's ankle and never fully recovered. Reliable information was rare. Overconfident nonsense was abundant. Step inside the Victorian Gentlemen's Club, where the air is so thick with pipe smoke and cologne that you could cut it into cubes and serve it for dessert. Leather armchairs creak under the collective weight of secrets, and the main entertainment is listening to Reginald at the bar attempt to explain the facts of life, despite knowing less than your average garden snail. If you're a young man in search of wisdom, you might think you've found the right place. After all, this is where real men gather to discuss important matters, politics, horse racing, and why Jenkins insists on eating his soup so noisily. But when the conversation drifts to the topic of women or relationships, the room becomes a theatre of bravado and bluster. Advice is dispensed with all the subtlety of a marching band. The key to happiness, declares the club's resident expert, who incidentally has been single for 20 years, is to keep your collar stiff, your upper lip stiffer, and never, under any circumstances, allow yourself to be alone in a room with a woman and a potted plant. No one quite understands why the potted plant is dangerous, but everyone nods, afraid to look ignorant. Tall tales are currency. There's always a story about someone's cousin's friend who knew a stable boy who eloped with a duchess, only to discover she was actually a French spy. Or the legendary time when old Colonel Fitzherbert glimpsed a bare shoulder at the opera and was forced to retire to the country for health reasons. The more absurd the anecdote, the more likely it is to be repeated as gospel, if you press for specifics. But Reginald, how does courtship actually work? You get a lot of muttering about firm handshakes, the dangers of French novels, and the need to keep one's wits about oneself, especially in the presence of lace. Someone inevitably brings up the talk he received from his own father, which usually amounted to a stern warning about table manners and a reminder never to whistle indoors. Actual facts are scarcer than a fresh egg in January. The advice on marriage is no better. You're warned to watch out for ambitious mothers, scheming aunts, and women who have opinions about wallpaper. There's a vague sense that married life involves learning to apologize often and developing a mysterious interest in fishing, purely for the solitude. The general consensus is that emotions are dangerous. Conversation is riskier, and any signs of affection must be concealed beneath at least 3 layers of sarcasm and 2 waistcoats. Any mention of physical intimacy causes the conversation to scatter in a dozen directions. Suddenly, everyone's got somewhere to be. Whether it's a billiards game, the study of an especially interesting stain on the wallpaper, or the urgent need to reorganize the snuff tins. On the rare occasion the subject is broached, it's with a level of vagueness that would make a lawyer proud. Euphemisms abound: performing one's duty, paying a visit to the conjugal chamber, or simply attending to marital matters, all said with a knowing look and a quick change of subject. Yet beneath all the bravado and deflection, there's a shared sense of confusion, a fraternity of men who, in their heart of hearts, are just as baffled as anyone else. Occasionally, one brave soul admits to knowing nothing at all, and for a brief, shining moment, everyone relaxes. Then Jenkins sneezes, someone shouts, "To the Queen!" and the ritual of stories and speculation resumes. So, you leave the club armed with nothing but half-remembered warnings and the conviction that you must never, under any circumstances, discuss actual feelings. Your questions remain unanswered, but at least you can tie a cravat and bluff your way through a conversation about wallpaper. And in the grand Victorian tradition, that's considered a success. Good night, and may your dreams be blissfully ignorant. Victorian doctors warned that self-abuse could cause everything from blindness to spontaneous combustion. Pamphlets listed symptoms including melancholy, indecision, and an over-fondness for poetry. Let's be clear. If you were an anxious Victorian adolescent with a pulse, your greatest enemy was not vice, or even temptation, it was pamphlets. These little booklets, often printed in a barely readable Gothic font, could be found tucked into hymnals, hidden under your uncle's chair cushion, or stacked next to the family Bible. Their titles were always variations on moral health and the young gentleman or a guide to purity and prosperity, and their contents were enough to frighten even the most determined troublemaker into a life of embroidery. The message was always the same: don't touch yourself, don't think about touching yourself, and if you find yourself accidentally touching yourself, say 3 Hail Marys, eat a dry biscuit, and think about the Queen. The medical authorities, almost exclusively men, with especially bushy sideburns, insisted that self-abuse would lead to a parade of horrors. These included not only the classics, like blindness and insanity, but also sagging posture, diminished vigour, and the tendency to become a Frenchman. In some pamphlets, the consequences got creative. One even warned that overindulgence would lead to ears falling off, or a fate worse than death. Poor penmanship. Parents and schoolmasters took these warnings to heart. Bedrooms were carefully policed for suspicious activity. Door hinges were oiled to allow for stealthy surprise inspections. If your mother thought you looked peaky, you'd be subjected to an urgent regime of cold baths, outdoor calisthenics, and a new hobby involving glue and pine cones. Meanwhile, fathers advised a brisk game of cricket, the solution to all life's mysterious urges. No one wanted to discuss what the urges were, or why they happened, only that they could be banished by hard work and the proper use of a letter opener. Of course, the real fear was ignorance. Young people who managed to get their hands on a medical book, or worse, an actual anatomy textbook, were left more confused than ever. These books were heavy on the moral consequences and light on the practical details. One infamous diagram, meant to illustrate the dangers of youthful indiscretion, simply showed a withered tree and the words, "This, too, could be you." Poetry, especially the moody kind, was considered both a symptom and a cause. If you began writing verses about moonlight or lilies, your family would gather for an emergency prayer session and possibly send you away to a sanatorium with exceptionally plain wallpaper. If you dared ask a doctor for clarification, you'd be treated to a stony silence or a vague warning about losing your vital essence. One renowned physician recommended carrying a small potato in your left pocket at all times to absorb unwanted energies. No one knew if this actually worked, but it did result in the potato industry's best quarter since the Irish famine. Teachers did their best to enforce discipline, which in practice meant everyone lived in terror of being found idle. If you looked too content during quiet time, you'd be assigned a 10-page essay on the virtues of manual labour, or a shift in the school garden, digging for moral fibre among the turnips. Early to bed and early to rise wasn't just advice for financial success. It was an attempt to reduce the hours available for mischief. And yet, despite all the fear-mongering, pamphleteering, and stern lectures, nature had its way. Young Victorians grew up, generally avoided spontaneous combustion, and occasionally even wrote poetry without society collapsing. The only lasting side effect was an entire generation haunted by a lingering suspicion that reading too many novels could cause curly hair and a limp handshake. So you tuck yourself in, avoid making eye contact with the family potato, and hope tomorrow brings fewer pamphlets and more common sense. Good night, and may your dreams be guilt-free, pamphlet-free, and ever so slightly rebellious. For young Victorians, romance novels were less about passion and more about the perils of fainting in a field. Any book that mentioned ardour or yearning was usually kept on the top shelf next to the household's only copy of Gray's Anatomy, unopened for safety. Imagine yourself as a curious Victorian teenager. You've devoured every story in your Sunday school primer and embroidered all the handkerchiefs in the house. Desperate for something a bit more exciting, you scan the family bookshelf and spot a forbidden treasure, the complete tales of Lady Arabella's yearning heart. You stretch on tiptoe, risking life and limb, and possibly scandal if your petticoat shows, to reach the book, all while making sure mother is occupied with her lemon water and father is out judging the shrubbery. Romance novels in this era were supposed to be wholesome, moral, and, most importantly, unspeakably boring. The heroines are pale and easily startled. The heroes are brooding and so emotionally repressed that a passionate glance at a teaspoon might set off 3 chapters of internal monologue. If there is a declaration of love, it's couched in phrases like, "I find your presence agreeable," which, in Victorian terms, is basically a marriage proposal with a side of heart palpitations. For young women, these novels offered both an escape and a warning. Every second page featured some poor heroine nearly swooning at the mere touch of a gloved hand, or being sent to the countryside to recover from the devastating effects of a brisk walk with a gentleman. The message was clear. Excitement leads to fainting. Fainting leads to ruined reputations, and ruined reputations, well, you might as well move to the colonies and raise turnips. And yet, these books flew off the shelves, often smuggled under petticoats or read by candlelight after everyone else had gone to bed. Girls whispered about the latest scandalous plot twists, like Lady Felicity dropping her embroidery hoop at a garden party, or Lord Byron, not that one, the fictional one, sending a bouquet of violets tied with a blue ribbon, the 19th century equivalent of sliding into someone's DMs. For every stern lecture about the dangers of romance novels, there was a growing secret society of girls passing around dog-eared pages like illicit treasure. Of course, the guardians of public morals did their best to stamp out literary rebellion. Mothers, aunts, and particularly nosy housekeepers conducted routine shelf inspections. Any book containing the words yearning, embrace, or, heaven forbid, smouldering, was swiftly relocated to the top shelf, where only the family spider had any chance of reading it. If a novel described a single exposed ankle, it was deemed unfit for human consumption. The real wild card, however, was the family's medical encyclopedia, Gray's Anatomy, which sat right next to the forbidden romances. Ostensibly a scientific text, it was shrouded in so much myth and terror that no one dared open it. Most children suspected that looking inside would either cause instant blindness or teach you facts so shocking you'd never recover. Better to stick with Lady Arabella and her highly chaste suitor, Sir Percival. Meanwhile, young men approached romance novels with a mixture of curiosity and fear. If caught reading such literature, a boy might be dispatched to chop wood until he forgot all about Lady Felicity's blushing cheeks. Instead, boys told each other wild stories about what they imagined happened in those pages, usually far tamer than reality, but told with enough bravado to make it sound positively French. Despite all efforts at censorship, the allure of forbidden love stories was irresistible. Romance novels provided a script for feeling things, even if the only ardor anyone experienced was the panic of getting caught. So you tuck the book beneath your pillow, safe from prying eyes, and drift off to dreams of stilted courtships, overacted blushes, and heroes who express their deepest feelings through punctuation. Good night, and may your novels be just scandalous enough. Women suffering from hysteria were told to avoid spicy food, horse riding, and all forms of excitement, lest their uterus become wandering. Treatment options ranged from smelling salts to something involving a hand-cranked medical device your grandmother never spoke of. Let's step into the parlour, where the air is thick with lavender sachets, the only thing thicker than the curtain of confusion hanging over Victorian medicine. If you were a woman feeling a bit anxious, sad, irritable, or just tired from carrying the weight of 50 pounds of petticoats and social expectations, you were likely to be diagnosed with hysteria, the catch-all explanation for everything from insomnia to having an opinion. The official theory was simple and horrifying. The uterus, left unchecked, might start roaming the body, causing all manner of mischief. This wandering womb was blamed for fainting spells, mood swings, headaches, and the occasional strong urge to eat an entire treacle tart. One wrong move, a gallop on a spirited pony, or, heaven forbid, a spicy supper, and your insides might simply set off for a brisk walk around your ribcage. Treatment was, to put it mildly, eclectic. The first line of defense was a whiff of smelling salts, the universal Victorian cure for everything from surprise to actual medical emergencies. If a lady fainted, which happened with clockwork regularity thanks to corsets and social awkwardness, someone would immediately dash forward with a bottle of ammonia, holding it under her nose until she was revived, or at least distracted from her original complaint. If smelling salts failed, the next step was a prescription for absolute rest. Rest meant staying indoors, lying on a fainting couch, and being weighted on hand and foot. While this sounds blissful, it usually came with lectures about not reading novels, not participating in lively conversation, and above all, not thinking about anything too stimulating, like politics or mathematics. Medical journals earnestly warned that excitement of any kind could lead to a dramatic outbreak of nerves. But rest wasn't always enough. Enter the doctor, a man with impressive whiskers, a grave expression, and an alarming collection of implements in his bag. He might prescribe mild exercise, preferably embroidery, or a supervised stroll around the garden, but never, ever horse riding, too thrilling, swimming, far too modern, or vigorous walking. No one needs to be that ambitious. If symptoms persisted, doctors would recommend the infamous pelvic massage, a treatment as awkward as it was mysterious. And the real reason fainting couches existed in the first place. The invention of the hand-cranked medical massager was hailed as a miracle of science, though no one explained what it actually did, and certainly not in mixed company. Grandmothers clammed up, mothers pretended not to know, and aunts just coughed nervously and reached for their embroidery hoop. There was also a thriving market in patent medicines, bottles of nerve tonic, soothing syrup, and Mrs. Winslow's calming cordial. These concoctions were mostly alcohol, laudanum, or sugar water, but the label guaranteed to relieve symptoms of feminine restlessness and restore natural calm to the mind and womb. If you didn't feel better, at least you felt a bit tipsy, which was almost as good. On particularly bad days, a woman might be sent away for a rest cure at a seaside sanatorium, where she'd be fed bland food, forced to nap, and occasionally prescribed ice baths. Doctors took her pulse, measured her size, and noted her progress on long, serious-looking charts. Meanwhile, her real ailment, a world that refused to listen to her, went unmentioned. So, as you lie back and consider your own 21st century nerves, maybe give a silent thanks that your uterus is no longer blamed for your mood swings, and that the only thing wandering these days is your attention during another Zoom meeting. Good night, and may your dreams be free of wandering organs and hand-cranked devices. School biology was limited to diagrams of frogs and a stern warning that actual human anatomy was best left to the imagination. Victorian textbooks were so vague that even your skeleton felt embarrassed. Picture yourself sitting stiffly in a chilly classroom, sunlight filtered through frosted windows, and the only warmth in the room coming from the teacher's glare. Today's lesson is anatomy, a term so fraught with peril that your classmates look ready to faint. At the front of the room stands a blackboard, already decorated with a meticulous sketch of a frog, legs splayed, eyes bugging out, a look of existential confusion that every student instantly recognizes. In Victorian England, dissecting a frog was as risque as education got. You could talk about the heart, as long as you meant the frog's heart, the liver, in a strictly culinary sense, or perhaps the thigh muscle, so long as you blushed while saying it. Anything resembling human anatomy was swaddled in euphemism, whispered warnings, and more hedging than the entire Chelsea flower show. The phrase private parts was never uttered. If pressed, your instructor might wave vaguely at the general vicinity of the lower abdomen and say, "Here be mysteries," before moving hastily onto the wonders of amphibian digestion. Textbooks did their best to skirt the issue, sometimes literally. You'd open to a chapter titled The Human Frame, expecting revelations, only to find a page devoted to the marvel of elbows. There would be a careful illustration of a joint, labelled the region between the upper and lower limb, and a paragraph extolling the virtue of keeping one's elbows off the dinner table. As for anything below the belt, the best you could hope for was a cryptic mention of the region best protected by good manners and sturdy trousers. Science classes became a masterclass in strategic vagueness. Questions about bones, blood, or anything remotely reproductive were answered with references to the Creator's wisdom and a sudden urge to practice handwriting. Skeletons, those poor, anonymous teaching aids, stood in the corner, draped in a shawl, lest anyone be tempted to examine their naughty bits. The human form was considered so sacred, so fraught with moral danger, that even referencing the existence of knees was only just acceptable, and only in winter. For girls, the situation was even more dire. Their lessons focused on the wonders of the digestive tract, so practical for future soup making, the importance of good posture, and the marvel of the lungs, for sighing and delicate coughing. Anything else was dismissed as unseemly curiosity. A truly brave student might slip a note to her friend. "Do you think we have as many bones as a frog?" Only to get back, "Possibly not. Mother says we are much more refined." If a child showed too much interest in how babies arrived, the official answer was, through the will of God and careful planning. Sometimes the teacher would direct the question to the Bible, which, in the hands of a determined adolescent, produced even more questions and exactly 0 diagrams. The only real information circulated in the form of rumours. A cousin's friend claimed to have seen a medical textbook, while a daring brother described the scandalous statues in the museum. Of course, these descriptions were exaggerated beyond all recognition. If someone's uncle was a doctor, he became an overnight celebrity, except no one actually dared to ask him anything specific, and he spent most family gatherings talking about feet. So, you finish your Victorian biology lesson knowing everything about frogs and absolutely nothing about yourself. As you pack away your books and straighten your modestly buttoned cuffs, you wonder if you will ever solve the great mystery of elbows or anything else. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with answers, diagrams, and, if you're feeling rebellious, a skeleton without a shawl. If you were sent away to boarding school, you might stumble upon a copy of The Young Man's Companion hidden behind a loose brick. It was mostly agricultural advice, but it also mentioned marital relations, sandwiched between chapters on turnip rotation. Let's set the scene. You've just arrived at St. Agatha's Academy for the morally upright and terminally confused. A vast stone fortress with more rules than windows and a chill that seeps into your very bones. Your uniform is itchy, your shoes are 2 sizes too small, and the headmaster's moustache has its own gravitational pull. You're homesick, you're slightly terrified, and above all, you're surrounded by other children who are just as uninformed and just as curious as you are. Boarding school is, in theory, about learning Latin declensions and how to eat pudding with a fork. In practice, it's a boot camp for surviving off rumour, speculation, and whatever knowledge can be cobbled together from overheard staff gossip and cryptic upperclassmen warnings. In the absence of actual education about the mysteries of adulthood, a kind of black market information network springs up. The older boys and girls whisper to the younger ones, each adding new details, deleting inconvenient facts, and generally transforming the subject of sex into a fever dream of half-truths and wild imagination. That's where The Young Man's Companion comes in. Smuggled from dorm to dorm, its battered pages are studied like a sacred text. Need to know how to shoe a horse, build a chicken coop, or impress your local squire with your knowledge of barley? It's all there. As for marital relations, the book provides a short, bewildering passage. After marriage, a man and his wife may enjoy mutual society and must always show respect for the virtues of industry and cleanliness. If you're lucky, there's a footnote warning about the perils of overindulgence, right before a detailed table of preferred beet varieties. The real education happens in the unlikeliest places, the dormitory after lights out, huddled under scratchy blankets with a contraband candle stub. Someone always claims to know a family doctor who explained everything in great detail. Another insists his cousin's friend's uncle once met the Prince of Wales, who is rumoured to be very knowledgeable on these matters. Facts morph into legend, then legend into myth, until you're half convinced that marital relations involve nothing more than polite conversation and synchronized potato peeling. Meanwhile, the school authorities maintain a stony silence. The closest thing to a health class is a lecture on the dangers of vigorously climbing trees, or the importance of keeping your thoughts pure. Teachers avoid all specifics. The chaplain warns against wickedness of the flesh, and the science master quietly turns any difficult question into a long discourse on photosynthesis. Girls' schools are no less shrouded in mystery. Here, rumours pass in embroidered handkerchiefs and coded notes hidden inside needlework samplers. What does it mean if you blush when the curate walks by? Can you get in trouble from reading too much poetry? The answers are always just out of reach, shrouded in caution, and the constant threat of having to write an essay on the virtues of modesty. Occasionally, a more daring student will stage a midnight raid on the staff library, returning triumphantly with a dictionary, only to find that conjugation means something entirely different from what everyone hoped. There is one actual anatomy book, but it's been locked in a cupboard since 1854, after it caused a minor riot in the third form. So you muddle through, piecing together scraps of wisdom, hoping not to get caught asking the wrong question or sneezing during chapel. When you finally leave for home, you're slightly taller, marginally better at geometry, and no closer to understanding marital relations, though you could rotate turnips like a professional. You drift off to sleep, the sound of distant bells in your ears, and dream of a world where all the answers are in the open, and the most dangerous thing about a book is the risk of a paper cut. Good night, and may your secrets be just safe enough. Victorian public health campaigns were mostly about warning you to avoid contact with strangers and never share a hairbrush. Diseases lurked everywhere, and accidental eye contact might be fatal. Step out your front door in Victorian England, and you'd best be ready to dodge invisible perils at every turn. The world was seen as a veritable obstacle course of potential infection, scandal, and, worst of all, embarrassment. Public health notices were plastered everywhere, and the messages all boiled down to one central theme: trust no one, and under no circumstances should you kiss the postman, even if he has excellent sideburns. Let's set the scene. You're getting ready for a rare stroll outside, having survived the harrowing ordeal of lacing up your boots and arranging your hat at a safe, sensible angle. Your mother intercepts you at the door, armed with an arsenal of warnings. "Don't touch the gate latch," she says. "It's practically crawling with miasmas." Miasmas, for those not fluent in 19th century pseudo-science, were the go-to explanation for all mysterious illness, bad air, lurking in foggy alleyways and under every doormat. Once in public, you must keep your distance. Victorian etiquette books advised never standing closer than 3 feet to a stranger, and preferably more if that stranger was sweating, coughing, or looked vaguely foreign. An ordinary trip to the market became an exercise in crowd avoidance, with shoppers performing a graceful, yet slightly panicked ballet to avoid accidental elbow contact. Anyone caught sneezing in public was treated like a human hand grenade. Best to drop your groceries and run. The true epicenter of public health panic was the post office. In a world before digital spam, your daily mail was as likely to bring cholera as good news. Mothers eyed every envelope with suspicion, sniffing for signs of contamination. The postman himself, once a symbol of cheerful reliability, became a walking biohazard. Children were taught never to accept sweets or gentle pats on the head, and absolutely never, under any circumstances, should they kiss the postman. Legend had it that doing so could result in everything from head colds to a scandalous reputation, both equally feared. It wasn't just postmen. The list of things to avoid was longer than a Sunday sermon. Never share a hairbrush. Lice could leap across the bristles like tiny Victorian gymnasts. Don't borrow a friend's gloves, lest you pick up glove fever. Avoid communal drinking cups, public benches, or any seat recently vacated by someone with a suspicious cough. If you absolutely had to visit the doctor, bring your own handkerchief. And don't touch the doorknob. Touch nothing, breathe carefully, and above all, don't look anyone directly in the eye unless you're prepared for a possible quarantine. Newspapers, eager to add drama to daily life, ran regular columns warning of fresh epidemics. "Local girl contracts typhoid after sitting too near a window," screamed one headline. 17 stricken after shared pie incident at parish picnic, claimed another. The public lapped it up, clutching their smelling salts and vowing never to eat communal pie again. Schools, ever vigilant, responded by enforcing a regime of healthful discipline. Every day began with a lecture about hand washing, though soap was in short supply and often replaced with a brisk scrub in cold water. Sharing combs or hats could earn you a stern letter sent home, and possibly exile to the sick room, a gloomy chamber decorated in the latest shades of pale green and existential dread. Despite all these rules, illnesses continued to spread, proving that even the sternest mother couldn't outwit the common cold. Still, the constant warnings did serve a purpose. They gave everyone something to talk about besides the weather, and provided an excellent excuse for avoiding awkward social situations. After all, nothing says good night in Victorian England like barricading your door and declining all invitations in the name of public health. Sweet dreams, and remember, no matter how charming he is, never kiss the postman. With no real sex education, the Cabbage Patch theory of baby delivery was alive and well. Some children believed babies arrived via telegram. Others suspected a complicated system involving storks, but everyone agreed it was best not to ask. Let's set the stage. You're a child in a respectable Victorian home, a world filled with secrets and silence where the grown-ups speak in riddles, and the answer to every truly interesting question is, you'll understand when you're older. One afternoon, you're sent out to the garden to help weed the cabbage patch, and your younger sibling asks, with wide, innocent eyes, "Where do babies come from?" The question hangs in the air like a summer thundercloud, and you freeze, suddenly aware you're treading into forbidden territory. Your choices are limited. If you ask an adult, you'll get an evasive answer about gifts from heaven or a fable involving cabbage leaves. The cabbage patch, after all, was not just a place for growing soup ingredients. It was the unofficial delivery ward for the stalk-averse British public. Some children would watch the cabbages carefully, waiting for signs of a baby emerging, tiny cries, a flutter of petticoats, maybe a little hat poking up between the leaves. If you found a suspiciously large cabbage, you'd keep an eye on it just in case it bloomed into a new sibling. Others had different theories. The arrival of a telegram was cause for suspicion. Babies, it seemed, were sometimes announced with the same solemnity as the Queen's birthday. "There's a special delivery coming," your father might say, eyes twinkling as if a new edition could simply be ordered by post. For children living in cities, the stork explanation was popular, but always with a uniquely British twist. The stork wore a bowler hat, delivered babies only to well-mannered homes, and always left a thank you note. The important thing was not to ask too many questions. Victorian etiquette demanded that all bodily matters, especially those involving birth, were left unspoken. If a neighbour's family suddenly increased by one, polite society pretended not to notice. The new mother would take to her bed for several weeks, and when she re-emerged, paler but mysteriously accompanied by a pram, no one mentioned the transformation. Babies simply appeared, as natural as fog and just as hard to explain. You and your friends, meanwhile, gathered in secret to swap the latest theories. The cabbage patch and the stork were favourites, but there were other, more elaborate ideas. A particularly inventive cousin insisted that babies were brought by the family doctor in his black bag, along with cough syrup and leeches. Another friend believed that a baby arrived whenever a lady wished hard enough while sewing a bonnet, provided she never dropped a stitch. The uncertainty didn't end there. The rules about how and when babies arrived were a minefield of superstition. Some children believed it was bad luck to ask for a sibling directly. If you did, you'd end up with a puppy instead. Others insisted that if you told a lie, a baby would arrive to remind you of your sins, although how this system was supposed to function remained gloriously vague. At home, the adults kept the mystery alive, perhaps out of embarrassment, perhaps out of habit. Mothers winked, fathers cleared their throats, and older siblings threatened to tell if you asked again. In a world obsessed with decorum, no one wanted to be the first to break the silence. So the cabbage patch theory lingered on, passed from one bewildered generation to the next, as comforting in its absurdity as any bedtime story. So you fall asleep, safe in the knowledge that the mysteries of the cabbage patch are as eternal as the changing seasons. And, for the time being, you're content not to know any more. Good night. And may your dreams be filled with polite vegetables and punctual storks. Victorian art students learned to sketch bowls of fruit and very modest landscapes. Any attempt at drawing the human form was strictly forbidden unless the model was a Roman statue, missing all the parts that matter. Imagine stepping into a Victorian classroom, the walls adorned with faded watercolours of forget-me-nots and inspirational quotes about virtue in all things. At the front, the art teacher, Mrs. Penelope Witherspoon, a woman who wears 17 layers of black tulle and hasn't smiled since the Crimean War, stands beside an imposing easel. The subject for today, a lumpy bowl of grapes and one suspiciously withered apple. The lesson, still life and why anything else is unacceptable. You and your classmates sit in stiff-backed chairs, carefully sharpening your pencils while trying to suppress any hope that the lesson might, just once, include the mysterious and forbidden world of figure drawing. That, you see, is simply not done. Any interest in sketching the human body is met with stern warnings about unwholesome curiosity, and if you so much as suggest drawing an ankle, you risk a month's detention and possibly a home visit from the local vicar. Instead, you are invited to contemplate the deeper meaning of grapes. Grapes are round, grapes are modest, grapes inspire no one to fits of inappropriate passion. The most risque subject you can hope for is a slightly suggestive zucchini, and even then you are advised to render it as unconvincingly as possible. A classmate once drew a banana with too much enthusiasm and was forced to recite the Book of Psalms every morning for a week. When it comes to landscapes, restraint is the rule. If a tree trunk appears too curvy or a brook too lively, you must immediately correct your work, lest your art be accused of stirring improper feelings. Human beings are occasionally permitted in the scene, but only as distant stick figures in top hats or bonnets, never in a bathing costume, and certainly never in a way that would require the use of a pink crayon. But what about anatomy? Surely you think at some point you must learn to draw arms, legs, or even, dare you say it, a face? The answer is yes, but only in the most abstract terms. The art room boasts a collection of Roman statues, all missing their arms, legs, or anything else that might provide useful reference. A marble bust of Cicero sits in the corner, staring blankly over the students' heads, offering inspiration and exactly zero practical instruction. Any statue with too many anatomical details has been tastefully draped in a velvet curtain for the sake of decency. On the rare occasion when a teacher attempts to address human anatomy, the lesson is vague to the point of abstraction. The arm, Mrs. Witherspoon in tones, is rather like a carrot, long, sturdy, and useful for reaching things. You squint at your own arm, unconvinced, and resolve to stick to grapes for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, rumours swirl about the advanced art schools in France, where students supposedly draw nudes, actual, living, undraped people. The very idea is scandalous enough to send the entire class into a fit of nervous giggles. Someone claims to have seen a French art book with a drawing of a bare foot, which, upon closer inspection, turned out to be a rather saucy potato. So you dutifully shade your grapes, avoiding any shadow that might be construed as suggestive, and dream of a world where artists are allowed to draw something more interesting than fruit. When the lesson ends, you pack up your pencils and slip out into the corridor, leaving behind a legacy of extremely modest produce. As you head to your next class, you wonder if you'll ever be allowed to sketch anything truly daring, like a whole unpeeled banana. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with tasteful still lifes and courageously modest apples. Courtship was a perilous journey where the accidental brush of fingers could result in scandal, expulsion from polite society, or a stern note from Aunt Mildred. The only thing riskier was dancing too close during the quadrille. Let's imagine it's a Friday evening in Victorian England, and you find yourself at the social event of the season, a local assembly ball. The room is a sea of crinolines and carefully coiffed hair, the air thick with the scent of lavender water, floor polish, and suppressed anxiety. The orchestra is tuning up, young ladies are giggling behind their fans, and mothers are lurking in corners, eyes narrowed and ready to pounce at the first sign of impropriety. At the heart of this delicate ecosystem is the ancient, unspoken law of courtship. No physical contact unless strictly supervised. Even a glance that lingers too long is cause for whispers. But the hand is a minefield. The mere act of touching fingertips could unleash a torrent of gossip that sweeps through the drawing rooms of 3 counties. In an era before texting, a fleeting brush of fingers during a promenade was the Victorian equivalent of sliding into someone's DMs at 2 a.m. Shocking, thrilling, and absolutely fraught with peril. You're standing awkwardly in the ballroom, gloved hands pressed to your sides, when you're asked to dance. The quadrille is announced. For the uninitiated, the quadrille is less a dance than a carefully orchestrated obstacle course designed to maximize distance while technically being a group activity. But, alas, there are moments when hands must meet, however briefly. You pray that your gloves are thick enough to withstand any accidental transmission of feelings. Heaven forbid your palm is clammy. Future marriage prospects could evaporate faster than a glass of lemonade in July. Now, should your hand linger even a fraction of a second too long, you're in dangerous territory. A chaperone clears her throat with the force of a small thunderstorm. Somewhere, Aunt Mildred's pen is already scratching out a note expressing her grave concerns. If the incident occurs under a particularly bright chandelier, the odds of being spotted and subsequently judged increase tenfold. Later that night, your mother will ask if anything improper occurred, while your father considers sending you to stay with relatives in Scotland until things blow over. This atmosphere of constant vigilance leads to inventive forms of flirtation. Fans are fluttered, eyes are widened, and conversations are laced with subtle, coded references. "Would you care for a stroll around the garden?" is loaded with meaning. But everyone knows that actual strolling is only permitted under the gaze of at least two older relatives, a housemaid and, ideally, the family dog. Any unchaperoned encounter is grounds for immediate engagement, or at least several years of pointed family jokes. Hand-holding is not just risky, it's seen as a declaration of intent. If a gentleman accidentally grazes a lady's glove, society expects wedding bells to ring before the month is out. The newspapers, always hungry for drama, might as well run a headline: "Local spinster gripped by scandal, finger touch shocks county." The repercussions echo far beyond the ballroom: cancelled invitations, tense teas, and of course the infamous talk about respecting one's reputation. For the truly daring, there is the option of the secret handshake, a forbidden ritual passed down from older siblings and school friends. This elaborate series of coded squeezes and taps allows for entire conversations to take place under the noses of oblivious adults. It's the Morse code of romance, and getting it wrong could lead to confusion, embarrassment, or a hastily arranged trip abroad. As the music fades and the couples bow politely, you retreat to the safety of the refreshment table, heart pounding, hands resolutely at your sides. Courtship, you realize, is less about love and more about successfully avoiding scandal. You go to bed that night, grateful for your gloves, and with a renewed respect for the sheer athleticism required to navigate a Victorian dance floor. Good night, and may your dreams be free of accidental handshakes and Aunt Mildred's letters. Bathing was considered both healthy and deeply suspicious. More than one bath a week was seen as a sign of moral decline. If your neighbour bathed on a Tuesday, you might start locking your doors. Let's step into the steamy, soap-scented world of the Victorian bathroom, if you can call it that. Bathing, in this era, wasn't a daily routine, it was a rare event, an act that prompted as much curiosity as concern. Imagine announcing at breakfast, "I think I shall take a bath today," and watching your family react as if you'd just declared you were running away to join the circus. Someone drops a teacup. Mother clutches her pearls. Father stares into his marmalade with a sense of impending doom. The bathroom itself is less spa sanctuary and more repurposed broom cupboard. Water is hauled in by the bucket, boiled, if you're lucky, or at least filtered to remove the larger wildlife. The tub, made of tin or, if you're truly fancy, porcelain, sits squat and unassuming in the centre of the room, looking for all the world like an artifact that should be in a museum, not filled with your naked relatives. If you're bathing at home, privacy is a rare commodity. Victorian houses are full of people, siblings, servants, the odd visitor from the Temperance Society, none of whom have ever mastered the art of knocking. Your only hope is to schedule your bath for a time when the entire household is distracted by a thunderstorm or an especially long sermon at church. Even then, you can expect at least one sibling to barge in, shriek, and vow never to speak of what they saw again. Soap is its own adventure. It comes in hard, lumpy cakes that smell faintly of lye, lavender, or possibly mutton fat. The first scrub is invigorating. The second is suspicious. And by the third, you're wondering if you'll ever get the residue out of your hair. Shampoo, as we know, it doesn't exist. Instead, you're handed a mixture of egg yolk, rainwater, and optimistic hope. If your hair emerges from this ritual at all, it's cause for celebration. For those without the luxury of an in-house tub, there's the local public bathhouse, a place equal parts community centre and den of iniquity, at least in the popular imagination. Mothers whisper warnings about who you might see there, and more importantly, who might see you. Bathhouse attendance is closely monitored. If you start going too often, rumours fly. Did you hear about Mrs. Pembroke? Bathed twice in 1 week. Her cousin married a Frenchman, so I suppose it runs in the family. And then there's the timing. The safest, most acceptable night for a bath is Saturday. Anything else is considered wildly suspect. If you choose to bathe on a Monday, you're either nursing a guilty conscience or hiding something truly dreadful. Tuesday bathers are simply beyond redemption. Neighbours will avoid you, children will stare, and the local vicar might casually drop by to check on your spiritual well-being. Bathing attire is another minefield. No one actually bathes naked if they can help it. Flannel bathing costumes, strategically draped towels, and well-placed bubbles are the order of the day. Modesty is protected at all costs, even from yourself. Victorian mirrors, mercifully, are cloudy at best, saving everyone from any accidental self-reflection. After all the effort, you emerge pink, exhausted, and vaguely virtuous, ready to face another week of sweat, coal dust, and hearty denial. Family members sniff approvingly from a distance and assure you that you look much improved. You vow not to repeat the ordeal for at least 7 days, maybe longer if you can manage it. So, as you settle into your reasonably clean bed, consider the wild, subversive thrill of an extra bath. In the Victorian mind, cleanliness may have been next to godliness, but only if it came in small, carefully rationed doses. Good night, and may your dreams be as fresh as a lavender-scented Tuesday scandal. If you were desperate for information, you could write to an advice column, only to receive a stern letter reminding you to keep your mind on embroidery, hymn singing, and not dying of embarrassment. Let's imagine you're a perplexed Victorian teen, your mind swirling with questions that your parents, teachers, and even your dog refuse to answer. Society has conspired to keep all mysteries locked safely away behind euphemism and a wall of starched linen. So what's a curious soul to do? Turn to the most intimidating font of knowledge available, the advice column. There's a good chance your newspaper or favourite ladies' magazine features a column with a name like Ask Aunt Agatha, the Duchess replies, or Madame Prudence's Counsel for the Delicate. Each week, hopeful correspondents pour out their anxieties onto fragile paper, posting them off to a faceless authority whose only credential is a steely resolve and a lifetime supply of lavender ink. Letters arrive from across the kingdom, penned by trembling hands, disguised with poetic initials, and, occasionally, addressed in backward code to avoid interception by nosy siblings. You can picture Aunt Agatha herself, spectacles perched at the end of her nose, pen poised like a sabre, and a will of iron forged in the fires of her own spectacular confusion. She's the terror of the terroom and the scourge of impertinence. She receives queries on everything from how does one remove a stain from lawn linen to what should a lady do if she suspects her fiancé enjoys poetry. The latter, of course, being a fate almost as dreadful as consumption. Desperate, you submit your own burning question. Is it normal for a young lady to feel strange flutterings in her heart upon hearing the footman recite Byron? Days later, the reply appears in the magazine. Dear, worried in Worcestershire, I suggest a brisk walk in the morning, the careful avoidance of spicy food, and a double row of stitches in your embroidery. Should the symptoms persist, consult your family doctor, provided he is not fond of poetry. The hallmark of Victorian advice columns is avoidance, with a side of moral panic. Questions about romance are batted away with advice to spend more time watering the ferns or volunteering at the local orphanage. Medical inquiries are met with stern reminders to never mention your spleen in mixed company. And if you ask anything remotely anatomical, the answer is almost always, do not trouble your mind with such matters. Good women need not know. Still, Some correspondents dare to push the boundaries. Dear Aunt Agatha, what should I do if I find a mysterious lump in my corset? The answer? Remove all corsets immediately and spend the afternoon reading wholesome literature by the fire, under supervision. If your question concerns the opposite sex, the safest reply is to maintain a safe and respectful distance at all times, unless engaged in a family board game. For every question asked, Aunt Agatha returns a volley of stern admonitions, practical household tips, and the occasional thinly veiled threat to involve the local vicar. Above all, dear readers, she writes, do not succumb to immoderate curiosity. The happiest women are those who mind their manners, their stitching, and their business. If she's feeling generous, she may include a recipe for blancmange or a new pattern for a doily, both of which are apparently cure-alls for social, romantic, and medical woes. And so, you set down the magazine with a sigh. Your questions still unanswered, your embroidery still in need of another row, but your spirit slightly buoyed by the knowledge that everyone else is just as bewildered as you are. In a world ruled by Aunt Agatha, ignorance truly is bliss, and perhaps that's the secret to Victorian contentment. Good night, and may your dreams be as neat as your needlework, and your curiosities suitably suppressed. The world of Victorian underwear was a labyrinth of laces, ties, and secret pockets. Understanding how to remove it was a lifetime's work, one rarely completed before the wedding night. Let's pull back the heavy velvet curtain on one of history's most closely guarded secrets, the Victorian undergarment. To the casual observer, a fully dressed Victorian lady or gentleman appeared composed, serene, and possibly upholstered. Beneath the starched collars and mountainous skirts, however, was a secret engineering marvel, a complicated underworld of layers that would put any modern escape room to shame. Begin with the chemise, a loose, cotton shift worn closest to the skin. Its job was to absorb the body's, shall we say, natural vapors, thus sparing the outer garments. Over this came the corset, a formidable device crafted from whalebone, steel, and sheer Victorian willpower. Laced tight enough to induce regular fainting, the corset's main purpose was to compress and elevate everything above the waist and flatten everything below. Tightening it was a two-person operation, best accomplished with a sturdy door handle, several strong friends, and a robust sense of humour. Next came the petticoats. Not one, not two, but sometimes as many as 5 or 6, layered for maximum volume and minimum mobility. Walking, sitting, and breathing all became heroic feats. Add to this the bustle, a sort of wearable shelf attached at the back to achieve that coveted just popped out of a bakery silhouette. Victorian underwear could make even the simplest trip to the chamber pot a complex logistical event, timed, rehearsed, and occasionally requiring written instructions. For men, the situation was hardly less mysterious. Drawers, baggy cotton shorts gathered at the knee, were the foundation, held up by suspenders that had their own set of buckles and rules. Add an undershirt, a waistcoat, and a pair of socks that would never, under any circumstances, match. Then came the braces, the Victorian term for suspenders, and, for extra panache, a garter or two. Even in the most private of moments, a Victorian gentleman remained, quite literally, tied up in knots. Somewhere in this labyrinth lurked secret pockets. Victorian underwear was remarkably practical for storing handkerchiefs, love notes, or, in the case of particularly resourceful ladies, emergency licorice drops. Of course, retrieving anything from these pockets required dexterity and memory. Which petticoat was it? Again, and often resulted in more confusion than relief. The rules of removal were even more arcane. Unfastening a corset involved undoing dozens of tiny hooks, each one designed to test your patience and finger strength. Undo the wrong lace, and you risked setting off a chain reaction that left you wrapped like a human ball of yarn. Husbands and wives often spent the early weeks of marriage in mutual confusion, wrestling with knots and ribbons, and desperately consulting etiquette books for diagrams that, conveniently, didn't exist. Laundry day was a public confession of private mysteries. Line after line of starched, ruffled undergarments fluttered in the garden breeze, each piece revealing more about the household than any dinner party ever could. Children were sent to collect the small things, blushing and giggling as they speculated about the mysterious lives of grown-ups. With all these layers, it's little wonder that Victorian romance moved at a glacial pace. The greatest act of trust wasn't a declaration of love or a stolen kiss, but the willingness to admit you needed help unfastening your buttons. For many, the puzzle of Victorian underwear was only solved with age, patience, and trial and error, sometimes literally, if you found yourself tangled in your own petticoats during an untimely thunderstorm. So as you nestle under your perfectly modern one-layer duvet, spare a thought for your Victorian ancestors. They may not have had the answers to life's great mysteries, but they did have plenty of secret pockets and a talent for making getting undressed the most complicated part of the day. Good night, and may your dreams be tangle-free. Every family had a story about a cousin who ate an apple in public, winked at a stranger, and was never seen again. The lesson: never tempt fate, fruit, or the local vicar. Let's peel back the rind of Victorian decorum and find ourselves at the very core of polite society's anxieties. Public displays of anything even vaguely suggestive, including, apparently, the innocent act of eating fruit. In an era where ankles were scandalous and piano legs needed skirts, the apple was a ticking time bomb of innuendo, waiting to explode on the nearest tea table. Picture the scene. You're attending a genteel garden party. The hedges are clipped to geometric perfection, the lemonade is watered down, and the conversation is as carefully pruned as the roses. The refreshment table is laden with biscuits, seed cake, and, for the truly daring, a bowl of gleaming, blushing apples. You reach for one, just a snack surely, but feel the eyes of 3 aunts, 2 vicars, and a passing magpie bore into your soul. Apples, after all, are not just fruit. They are symbols, and the Victorians loved a good symbol, preferably one they could clutch pearls over. The moment your cousin Beatrice dares to take a bite in public, jaws drop. She may as well have recited French poetry or removed her gloves before dessert. If, heaven forbid, she winks at a passing stranger, the universe all but implodes. The official family story, repeated in hushed tones over parlour games, says she was sent to live with distant relatives in Scotland, where apples are presumably eaten only in the dead of night, behind locked doors. Why the fuss? Well, blame the Bible, blame centuries of nervous preachers, or simply blame the enduring power of the world's oldest bad PR campaign. The apple, thanks to its starring role in the Garden of Eden, is loaded with the baggage of temptation and sin. Eating one with too much enthusiasm, or even, in certain circles, at all, was said to signal dangerous curiosity, moral decline, or even an over-fondness for poetry. It didn't help that apples required biting, crunching, and sometimes gasp, tongue movement, all of which were considered far too stimulating for mixed company. It wasn't just apples. Victorians harboured suspicions about all sorts of produce. Bananas were never, ever seen outside the fruit bowl. Even cucumbers required careful supervision, and ideally, a special fork. But apples were especially fraught. A well-timed apple incident could ruin a debutante's season, derail a promising courtship, or spark a family feud that would outlast the Crimean War. Behind every apple was a lesson. Don't tempt fate. Don't tempt the vicar. And for goodness sake, don't tempt anyone with fruit. If you must eat an apple, do so behind closed doors, with the curtains drawn and a prayer at the ready in case anyone knocks. At home, mothers warned their children not to go the way of Beatrice, a fate worse than social exclusion, because nobody could ever quite explain what happened next. Of course, there were always the family rebels, a cousin who nibbled at a pear during Lent, an uncle who brought oranges to the cricket match, or the neighbour's daughter who reportedly peeled a peach at the church picnic and still managed to marry well, proving, if nothing else, that luck sometimes favored the bold. The apple incident lived on in family lore, a cautionary tale and a source of secret giggles. In truth, Beatrice probably just moved to Liverpool, but that didn't stop Aunt Mildred from clutching her pearls whenever someone mentioned cider. So you finish your evening snack with a furtive crunch, grateful that in your world, fruit is just food, not a one-way ticket to scandal. Good night. And may your dreams be free of forbidden fruit, disapproving aunts, and apples with a reputation. In an era obsessed with cataloguing everything, Victorian scientists made bold claims about reproduction, usually wrong, always delivered with great confidence and impressive sideburns. Let's take a seat in the dim, mahogany-panelled study of a Victorian gentleman scientist. The shelves are groaning under the weight of books with titles like On the Habits of Field Mice and Practical Steam Power for Beginners. Amidst the test tubes, pickle jars, and one sadly neglected fern sits the latest scientific acquisition, the microscope. The most dangerous thing in the house, unless you count father's mustache wax, which is flammable, unregulated, and used liberally. Victorians prided themselves on knowing things, but reproductive science was a field where knowing things often meant confidently asserting whatever popped into your mind while squinting at something tiny in a petri dish. Reproduction, of course, was the ultimate mystery, the secret handshake of life. But in the absence of honest conversation or decent textbooks, scientists filled the void with theories, diagrams, and an avalanche of Latin words, most of which were misapplied. The microscope was all the rage, and Victorian naturalists peered through its lens with the excitement of children at a magic show. When one scientist claimed to have seen animalcules, tiny, wiggling sperm cells, in a drop of water, the resulting academic stampede was immediate and chaotic. Papers were published, experiments repeated, and debates held in the world's slowest, most awkwardly polite language. Did these animalcules have personalities? Could you tell a boy from a girl under a microscope? No one was sure, but everyone had an opinion. And most of those opinions were very, very wrong. For the general public, the findings of Victorian science were both dazzling and deeply confusing. The same man who could describe the lunar cycle in perfect detail would confidently declare that eating oysters improved virility, or that a firm handshake at breakfast increased one's chances of robust offspring. Scientific lectures, delivered to crowds of baffled townsfolk, always featured at least one slide labelled highly important, details to follow. Meanwhile, Victorian science about female reproduction was even murkier. With women excluded from most laboratories, the job of explaining ovaries fell to men who had rarely, if ever, met one. Theories abounded about wandering wombs, mysterious vapours, and the influence of the moon, preferably in its respectable, fully clothed phase. Medical textbooks were full of diagrams so abstract that they looked like maps to a lost city, or possibly an aggressive breed of cauliflower. Perhaps the only thing more impressive than Victorian ignorance was their ability to sound convincing. Scientists grew extravagant sideburns and adopted booming voices, so even if their conclusions were nonsense, at least they delivered them with style. When they described sperm, it was with great drama. These were not just cells, but heroic swimmers, bravely battling through a treacherous sea of metaphors and half-baked theories. Public demonstrations of science, so popular in this era, became showcases for bold guesses. Curious ladies and gentlemen packed into lecture halls to hear about the mysteries of generation, usually to leave more confused than when they arrived. Questions were sometimes permitted, but only if submitted in writing, signed with a false name, and discreetly burned afterward. And yet, the very act of looking through a microscope was radical. A small act of rebellion against centuries of secrecy. Children peered in, hoping for answers, and seeing only tiny, frantic dots. Adults nodded sagely, pretending they understood everything. The truth, of course, was elusive. Victorian science got a lot wrong, but it was, in its own clumsy, side-burned way, trying to drag the mysteries of life into the light. So you set aside your imaginary microscope, thankful that today's science is a little less mustachioed. and a lot more accurate. And as you drift off to sleep, may your dreams be filled with brave little animalcules, heroic lectures, and the comforting knowledge that, at least tonight, no one expects you to explain anything in Latin. Good night. Churches took up the job of sex education with all the subtlety of a marching band. Sermons about chastity and purity outnumbered hymns, and a vivid description of hellfire was considered age-appropriate for all listeners. Picture yourself in a cold stone church, the pews packed with uncomfortable parishioners arranged by age, status, and likelihood of causing a scene. Stained glass windows filter pale sunlight across the congregation as the organ wheezes its way through a hymn everyone pretends to know by heart. At the pulpit stands the vicar, ready to deliver what you hope will be a gentle word about love and kindness. But what inevitably turns out to be the weekly sin scoreboard, an enthusiastic lecture on chastity, purity, and the many, many creative ways you could doom your immortal soul before Sunday lunch. Victorian sermons about sex were a blend of fire, brimstone, and creative metaphors. One Sunday you'd get the parable of the lost sheep. Spoiler, don't be the sheep. And the next, a dramatic reenactment of Eve, the apple, and why fruit salad should be avoided in mixed company. The goal was clear: keep young people on the straight and narrow, preferably through fear, confusion, or sheer exhaustion. The word temptation echoed through the nave like a bell tolling for the end of all fun. The church didn't limit itself to broad warnings. Oh no, they kept meticulous records, real or imagined, of everyone's moral status. The sin scoreboard wasn't just a metaphor. There were actual ledgers in some parishes, recording everything from absences at evening prayers to inappropriate giggling during scripture readings. You lived in constant dread of being added to the list, sandwiched somewhere between Samuel caught daydreaming and Martha looked longingly at a potato during harvest festival. Any hint of impropriety was reported straight to the pulpit. If a girl was seen lingering too long outside the bakery, or a boy was spotted reading poetry behind the stables, a sermon on the dangers of unchecked desire would follow, complete with vivid descriptions of eternal torment and side effects, ranging from social disgrace to spontaneous combustion. Special mention was always made of the importance of modest clothing, with a handy reminder that even your thoughts could get you in trouble. The congregation would nod along, then immediately scan the pews to see who was blushing the hardest. Sunday school was no less alarming. Children's lessons focused on the moral perils of idle hands, wandering eyes, and curiosity, each one illustrated with a cautionary tale involving a lost lamb, a broken window, or a mysteriously missing hymn book. Questions about where babies came from were met with the story of the virgin birth, a miracle wrapped in so many layers of metaphor that most children left more mystified than before. If you made it to adolescence with your curiosity intact, the church doubled down. Youth group meetings were minefields of purity pledges, chaperoned picnics, and group prayers for anyone who showed signs of worldly interests. Leaders warned about the dangers of dancing, whistling, and, most perilous of all, unsupervised conversations with the opposite sex. Guard your heart, they cried. Though no one ever explained what you were supposed to guard it from, or how to do so without looking suspicious. And yet, in spite of all this vigilance, the real lesson most Victorians took from church was that guilt is eternal, but so is community. After all, everyone was suffering through the same sermons, singing the same hymns, and exchanging the same silent eye rolls. The sin scoreboard may have been terrifying, but it was also, in its strange way, unifying. So as you lay back tonight, grateful for modern sermons about love, hope, and maybe even tolerance, remember your Victorian ancestors, carefully tallying their virtues, ducking sermons, and somehow muddling through with their sense of humour intact. Good night, and may your dreams be free of sin scores and full of mercy. With open flirtations strictly forbidden, lovers sent secret messages using bouquets. A sprig of lavender meant I am yours, a daffodil said, you have lovely elbows, and an accidental turnip could spark a lifelong scandal. Step into the highly coded, faintly ridiculous world of Victorian romance, where direct communication was more perilous than crossing the street in front of a runaway carriage. To show interest in someone, you couldn't simply say, "You look smashing in that bonnet," or "I quite fancy your sideburns." No, here, love blossomed in silence and thrived on botany. The right bouquet was more meaningful than a proposal. The wrong root vegetable could end your social life. It all started with floriography, the Victorian art of flower language. Books the size of small dictionaries were published on the subject, each one offering a slightly different interpretation of what a bunch of violets might mean. If you fancied someone, you'd spend hours poring over lists, terrified of accidentally sending a message that read, "I wish you'd stop borrowing my umbrella." The only thing worse than expressing interest was doing it inelegantly. Lovers navigated this floral minefield with the precision of spies exchanging code in a le Carré novel. A red rose was dangerous, too forward for a first declaration. A pink rose was safer, hinting at affection without the risk of fainting relatives. Lavender meant, "I am yours," unless delivered upside down, in which case it meant, "Sorry, wrong address." A pansy said, "I'm thinking of you," but if paired with a sprig of rosemary, it might be interpreted as, "I'm thinking of you, but also reminding you to repay that 5 shillings. Even the delivery had to be carefully managed. Flowers presented by hand carried one meaning, while those left on a doorstep by moonlight had another. Woe to the admirer who trusted a younger sibling with delivery duties. Many a bouquet met its tragic end, trampled by the family dog or reassembled with a suspicious carrot from the kitchen garden. The language of flowers became so intricate that it spawned its own scandals. Once, a well-meaning suitor sent his beloved a carefully arranged bunch, daffodils for admiration, ivy for fidelity, and, unbeknownst to him, an accidental turnip for culinary variety. Unfortunately, the turnip, according to the lady's monthly floral oracle, meant obstinacy. Within days, rumours of a stubborn streak ran riot through the drawing rooms. The engagement was off, and the poor man spent months trying to clear his name with daisies and humble pie. Public events were hotbeds of floral flirtation. At garden parties, girls would drift past the punch bowl, eyes darting between bouquets and potential suitors, decoding meanings with all the gravity of an Oxford exam. Young men rehearsed their presentations for hours, desperate not to drop a hint or a hyacinth at the wrong moment. A single wilted bloom could spell social doom. For those less bold, pressed flowers in books were the medium of choice. Pages of poetry would hide a withered violet or a shy bit of heather, as secret and thrilling as a whispered compliment. Lovers separated by distance exchanged entire novels of meaning in the post. Every petal pressed flat, and every intention hidden in layers of ambiguity. As the system grew, so did the risk of misunderstanding. Sometimes, a friend would misinterpret a bouquet, or a maid would swap arrangements out of boredom. There are stories, delightedly retold by gossipy aunts, of marriages begun or ended because of a misdelivered sprig of rue or a tragic confusion between basil, hate, and mint, virtue. Only the bravest dared to use flowers to send a pointed message, like the famous onion of regret, which ended more than one engagement and at least 2 family friendships. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine a world where love letters come with leaves, where every daffodil is a dare, and even the turnips tell tales. May your dreams be fragrant, your meanings clear, and your bouquets always free of accidental root vegetables. Good night. Opening a Victorian-era medical book for sex education was like reading a car manual for relationship advice, needlessly technical, deeply confusing, and mostly about things you'll never see in real life. The only illustration was a vague, blurry, outline labelled figure A that could just as easily be a potato. Imagine being a curious Victorian adolescent with a burning question about life's greatest mystery. one you would never dare ask a parent, clergyman, or even the family parrot. After exhausting all other avenues, advice columns, whispered rumors, and the world's most disappointing art classes, you muster the courage to sneak a peek at the household's most forbidden tome, the medical textbook. The book itself weighs roughly as much as a newborn goat and smells strongly of mildew, ink, and generations of nervous fingers. You crack it open, heart pounding, only to be met with a wall of dense, Latin-heavy text. The chapter titles are intimidating: On the Peculiarities of the Human Form, Vaporous Disorders of the Womb, and the especially chilling notes on the moral decay of the spleen. The language is both technical and wildly euphemistic. If you hoped for straightforward facts, you'll be sorely disappointed. One page seems to describe the circulatory system using metaphors borrowed from gardening, roots, shoots, tubers, and all. The closest thing to a frank description of reproduction is a stern warning about indulgences leading to constitutional collapse, melancholy, or an alarming fondness for walnuts. When you reach the illustrations, things get worse. Instead of clarifying anything, the images offer only further confusion. There's figure A, ostensibly the female reproductive system, but looking suspiciously like a root vegetable on a bad day. Figure B might be a diagram of the male form, but could just as easily be a Victorian hairbrush. Shading is inconsistent, proportions are bizarre, and every interesting part is left either unlabeled, missing, or artfully hidden behind a decorative flourish. Attempting to decipher the text only deepens your confusion. You discover long passages on the dangers of self-abuse, endless speculation about the movement of vital fluids, and repeated mentions of the moon's influence on women's moods. There are dire warnings about excessive thought, inappropriate reading, and the consumption of tomatoes, all of which are somehow tied back to your mysterious anatomy. By the time you reach the chapter on puberty, you're convinced the only way to survive adolescence is to avoid spicy food, cold drafts, and any sudden movements. Of course, the section on marriage is equally baffling. Husbands are advised to be gentle but firm, while wives are encouraged to submit with dignity and preserve the harmony of the home. No diagrams, no specifics, and certainly nothing that might prepare you for the reality of the wedding night. If you're lucky, the appendix includes a practical guide for marital health, which is actually 3 pages of poetic advice about the importance of sleeping with your windows open and never making eye contact with a brass bed frame. To make matters worse, medical books often contradicted themselves or each other. One expert insists that all emotional problems stem from the liver, another blames a wandering uterus, and a third says the real culprit is reading too many French novels. None of them agree on what, exactly, should be done about any of this, though most suggest a brisk walk and a diet of unsalted porridge. You close the book feeling none the wiser, but certainly more anxious. The secrets of the human body remain shrouded in mystery and potato-shaped diagrams. You might try your luck with a family dictionary next time, or just accept that some things are destined to remain unknowable. So as you turn out the light, remember the brave souls who sought answers in those bewildering tomes, and be grateful for modern science and actual illustrations. Good night, and may your dreams be free of root vegetables, contradictory advice, and figure A. Victorians believed that eating too much beef could incite dangerous passions, especially in teenagers. Medical journals warned parents that stimulating foods like steak, onions, or, heaven forbid, a ripe tomato might unleash uncontrollable urges and send you running for the fainting couch. Imagine sitting down at the dinner table, where roast beef glistens in the candlelight, potatoes are piled high, and a platter of onions threatens the very fabric of family decency. You either stake with suspicion, fully aware, thanks to the many dire warnings you've received, that a second helping could be your one-way ticket to scandal. Your mother, ever vigilant, serves you an extra spoonful of cabbage. Safe, bland, reassuringly green, and your father clears his throat to read aloud a timely passage from Dr. Wimple's Guide to Youthful Purity. Victorian England, ever inventive in its anxieties, was convinced that food, like literature, fresh air, and certain colors, could corrupt the impressionable young mind and body. Beef, with its robust flavor and dangerous redness, was chief among the culprits. Medical authorities, most of whom had never actually spoken to a teenager, issued warnings in the popular press. Too much animal flesh encourages excessive energy, inappropriate dreams, and, in the case of mutton, immoderate daydreaming. The solution? Subtle forms of culinary discipline. Porridge for breakfast, boiled chicken for lunch, and, if you'd been exceptionally well behaved, a sliver of overcooked lamb for dinner. And it wasn't just the meat. The list of stimulating foods expanded with every new issue of the Victorian Temperance Gazette. Onions were out, too spicy. Tomatoes were doubly forbidden, being both red and foreign. Shellfish were said to bring on fainting spells, and anything seasoned with pepper was to be reserved for confirmed bachelors and continental visitors. The safest course was a menu consisting of gruel, bread, and whatever vegetable most resembled a pale, unthreatening root. All this was supposedly for your own good. The medical journals made it clear. Red cheeks, the inevitable result of robust dining, are a warning sign of dangerous internal passions. Parents would keep a close eye on you during mealtimes, ready to intervene should you show any sign of enthusiasm for a particular dish. A flush in the face led to speculation. Were you merely warm, or had the beef begun to work its forbidden magic? If you happened to be a teenager, already suspected of teetering on the edge of disaster, the scrutiny was doubled. Young men were advised to avoid strengthening foods lest they be overtaken by vigor, unaccompanied by sense. Young ladies, meanwhile, were urged to decline seconds, sip only tepid water, and refrain from the reckless consumption of fruit desserts. All eyes were on your plate, and every bite was a moral decision. Of course, rumors circulated among the youth. Some whispered that a slice of rare beef granted mysterious powers, courage for exams, stamina for cricket, or the sudden urge to recite poetry. Others insisted that red cheeks were a sign of having been kissed, the evidence for this being precisely zero but deeply believed. Every boarding school had its own folk remedies for calming the blood. Cold baths, walking in the rain, or reciting the multiplication tables backward at top speed. Dinner parties, meanwhile, became exercises in social tightrope walking. Guests navigated the menu with care, passing over the beef in favor of bland root vegetables, complimenting the hostess on her restraint. The brave or foolhardy guest who reached for the steak knife was guaranteed a round of discreet gasps and, possibly, a later visit from the family doctor. So you finish your meal, grateful for the dull but safe embrace of boiled cabbage. As the candles sputter out and your parents murmur prayers of gratitude for another day without incident, you drift off to bed, cheeks just the right shade of pale. Good night, and may your dreams be free of forbidden steak, dangerous tomatoes, and the perilous blush of youthful vigor. Victorian children lived in fear of self-abuse, and everyday items like hairbrushes, chair legs, and even loose bedclothes were treated as agents of moral downfall. Entire lectures were devoted to the correct, shame-free use of the hairbrush, preferably in public and never after dark. Let's dim the gas lights and step into a perfectly ordinary Victorian nursery, complete with heavy curtains, a dozen moralizing maxims stitched onto samplers, and a shelf lined with objects that, in any other era, would be considered harmless. Here, however, each item carries a warning and, quite possibly, the weight of your immortal soul. The hairbrush is at the center of it all, a simple wooden implement, bristling with both natural fibers and suspicion. Every morning, your governess appears at your bedside, hairbrush in hand, prepared to commence the sacred ritual of grooming. But make no mistake, this isn't just about personal hygiene. The act of brushing hair must be performed under strict supervision, in full view of siblings or an adult. The brush is wielded with the same solemnity as a church relic, each stroke measured, each tangle a silent struggle against temptation. Why so much fuss? Victorian advice manuals and medical pamphlets had plenty to say. Idle hands are the devil's playground, they warned, and there was no more dangerous playground than your own scalp. The hairbrush, left in the wrong hands, meaning your own, was believed to inspire unseemly thoughts or, worse, forbidden experimentation. To avoid the perils of self-abuse, children were told to use the hairbrush only as directed, never with more enthusiasm than necessary, and always while maintaining a look of pure, untroubled innocence. The rules didn't stop there. The hairbrush must never be brought into bed. Bedclothes, already a source of anxiety due to their loose, billowy nature, were seen as potential accomplices in acts of moral disaster. If a child was discovered brushing their hair under the covers, even just to detangle a stubborn knot, the incident would be reported in hushed tones at the next family council. Remedies ranged from lectures about the dangers of overstimulation to threats of extra arithmetic, cold baths, and, in extreme cases, the confiscation of all personal grooming items until further notice. Chair legs, too, were subject to scrutiny. Any hint of inappropriate fondness for furniture, lingering in an armchair, running one's fingers along the balusters of the staircase, sitting sideways on a piano bench, could arouse suspicions of moral weakness. Governesses developed a sixth sense for detecting improper postures, swooping down on their charges with a flurry of corrections and not so subtle reminders that virtue was always a matter of angles. Bedtime, for many children, was the most perilous hour. Blankets and sheets, warm and inviting, were supposed to be tucked tightly under the chin, hands folded on the chest like a saint in a stained glass window. Stray limbs or fidgeting could prompt a stern inspection and a warning about straying from the path of righteousness. Some households even experimented with mittens, sewn to nightgowns, to prevent any unconscious moral infractions. Lectures about the proper use of the hairbrush, and everything else, were a routine part of growing up. Mothers, fathers, and hired experts all weighed in with advice, stories of cautionary cousins, and endless reminders that discipline now would lead to happiness later. "Brush your hair with dignity," said one popular manual, "for a virtuous head is a tidy head." And so, you learn to treat every object with respect and a healthy dose of paranoia. You keep your hairbrush in plain sight, never linger in armchairs, and sleep as still as possible, all the while dreaming of a world where bedtime means comfort, not a moral obstacle course. As you drift off to sleep, be thankful for the blissful ignorance of your own pillow and the freedom to brush your hair whenever you like. Good night, and may your dreams be free of haunted hairbrushes, anxious governesses, and furniture with a reputation. In a world obsessed with plants, even botany lessons came with a warning label. Young ladies were advised not to stare too intently at a blooming orchid, lest they become overwhelmed with unladylike curiosity. And don't get anyone started on the shape of the eggplant. Imagine yourself in the conservatory of a respectable Victorian academy, sunlight streaming through dusty glass, the air thick with the fragrance of soil and an undercurrent of forbidden intrigue. The teacher, Miss Portia Larkspur, with a bun so tight it could slice bread, stands ready to extol the virtues of plant life, armed with a pointer and a floral apron that reaches almost to her ankles. The subject is botany, and the goal is to learn the wonders of nature without losing your innocence or, worse, your reputation. The first lesson is always safe. Observe the delicate structure of the daisy. Daisies are pure, humble, and above suspicion. But move on to orchids, and the tension in the room grows thick as a hothouse vine. Victorian guides to decorous plant study warned that certain blooms, particularly those with immodest symmetry, were best admired from a distance, or if possible, not at all. A lady might faint at the mere sight of a particularly lush rose or a Venus flytrap with its mouth agape. It was rumoured that staring too long at a blossom could lead to blushes, questions, or, heaven forbid, a sudden interest in poetry. Things only got more complicated with the arrival of the eggplant, a vegetable whose silhouette was considered so suggestive that it was rarely depicted in art, recipes, or even polite conversation. If a kitchen garden produced a bumper crop, the household cook would discreetly rebrand them as aubergines, wrap them in newspaper, and sneak them into the stew under cover of darkness. The very word eggplant could trigger a fit of giggles among the younger pupils and a quick reprimand from Miss Larkspur. The curriculum, such as it was, made heroic efforts to avoid anything that might excite unladylike curiosity. Diagrams in textbooks showed only roots, stems, and the occasional unremarkable leaf. Flowers were rendered in soft pastels, petals demurely tucked in, and all reproductive parts were either omitted or blurred beyond recognition. Students dutifully sketched from these sanitized models, their imaginations left to fill in the blanks, sometimes with disastrous results. Now and then, however, there emerged a bold spirit, the blushing botanist. Every school had one, a girl with a sharp eye and a talent for finding the naughtiest-looking root vegetables at the farmer's market. She would smuggle in a real orchid, hidden in a lunch pail or the folds of a large bonnet, and show it to her classmates during free time. Gasps, giggles, and wild speculation followed. "Do you think it's true?" one whispered, that Queen Victoria herself once fainted at the sight of a peony. For the few boys allowed into these classes, things were no easier. The simple act of drawing a cucumber could land you in the headmaster's office for a stern lecture on the dangers of botanical impertinence. And don't even think about growing pumpkins. Those were considered outright scandalous, particularly in October. Still, despite all efforts to keep plant study pure and proper, nature had a way of undermining Victorian best intentions. Flowers continued to bloom in all their flamboyant, unapologetic forms. Eggplants persisted in being eggplants. And behind the sternest warnings, there was always a whisper of curiosity, a sense that the world was full of secrets, just waiting to be discovered. So, as you close your eyes tonight, remember the blushing botanists of the past, bravely facing the orchids, daring to wonder about the eggplant, and surviving their lessons with both curiosity and dignity intact. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with harmless daisies, daring orchids, and absolutely no unchaperoned vegetables. So, as tonight's journey through Victorian sex education winds down, let's take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come. You've survived warnings about the dangers of tomatoes, lessons in hairbrush etiquette, and enough euphemisms to last several lifetimes. You've wandered the hallways of a world where ankles were scandalous, elbows were mysterious, and knowledge was something you learned by accident if you were lucky. Somehow, through a haze of misinformation, moral panic, and an entire botanical garden's worth of metaphors, people muddled their way forward. They blushed, they stumbled, they embroidered elaborate undergarments and passed secret notes written in flower petals. And still, somehow, the species continued. Proof that even the most baffling curriculum can't stop human curiosity or persistence, or frankly, nature itself. Tonight, as you lie back in your perfectly scandalous modern bed, maybe whisper a quiet thank you for Google, for actual biology classes, and for a world where you can say pregnant without anyone fainting into a doily. Be grateful for honest conversations, clear diagrams, and the freedom to ask questions without having to speak in Morse code. Because history is full of suffering, embarrassment, and a truly wild assortment of medical advice, but it's also proof that people are stubborn, hopeful, and hilariously resilient. Our ancestors navigated an obstacle course of confusion so that you, dear listener, could enjoy the wonders of central heating, proper sex education, and maybe, if you're lucky, a blissful night's sleep. So, close your eyes, let the absurdities of Victorian England fade into the background, and rest easy knowing you've survived another historical misadventure. Sweet dreams, and may your pillows be free of lace, your thoughts free of panic, and your bedtime stories always end in gentle laughter. Good night.